2 weeks ago, we talked about conspiracy theories and how they really gummed up efforts to understand MH370. One of the core ideas of conspiracy theories is that the government, in particular the US government, is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-seeing. That basically they have crystal clarity on everything that happens everywhere. And so they definitely must know what happened to MH370, and if they don't, they're probably lying. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by an actual real-life veteran of the U.S. military intelligence community. We're going to talk about what the geopolitical situation looked like circa 2014 from the intelligence community's perspective, and how they saw Russia and its motives and its capabilities at that time. Stick around after the interview. I've got a very interesting community radar segment about an MH370 theory that's been making the rounds in the media these days. Hi, everybody. Jeff Wise back with you for episode 15 of season 2, Finding MH370. First, a word about the Flaperon project. If you've been following the podcast, you know that I've been working with Keeley to put together a project to put flaperons and or drifter buoys into the water near the Seventh Arc on the 11th anniversary of the disappearance in an attempt to get new evidence about what happened to the plane. We'll have much more about that starting next week and in the weeks that follow. For now, I wanted to talk about a poll that I had put up on the YouTube page. The question was, would you support an effort to gather new MH370 data by launching a flaperon or drifters in the Southern Indian Ocean on March 8th, 2025. Well, we got 57 votes, which I thought was great. And I thought the answers were interesting. Choice number 1, no, I think you should launch yourself into the ocean. That got only 9%. Thank you to the 91% who didn't think I should throw myself in the ocean. Option 2, yes, I'd like to help out by doing research and generating ideas. 14%. Great. Option 3, yes, I'd support a GoFundMe to buy parts and set them adrift. 23%. Fantastic. Almost a quarter of people willing to support this idea financially. That's really cool. Finally, option 4, yes, I'd like to see it happen, but would prefer to simply observe. 54%. That's great. I will take any kind of support. The fact that you're interested and think it's a good idea, that is wind beneath my wings. Okay, now on to the main show. Today's guest is Steve Harrell, non-resident senior fellow with the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He is going to give the inside scoop on what the world looks like from the perspective of U.S. military intelligence. Steve graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy. He has a master's degree in strategic studies from the U.S. Army War College. He went on to serve in naval intelligence for 30 years. And 3 of those years, from 2012 to 2015, he was at U.S. European Command. So they were paying close attention to what Russia was doing. I was really excited to hear how U.S. military intelligence perceived Russia's motives and methods around the time of 2014 for obvious reasons. And at the end of the interview, I asked him whether the intelligence community had considered the possibility that MH370 was a cyber hijack. I found his answer extremely interesting. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to have you. You and I had a preliminary conversation, so we've talked about some of these things already, but you have a very impressive background. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about it. For your undergraduate degree, you went to the Naval Academy.
I did. Actually, thanks for having me. Start off with that as well. Looking forward to this whole conversation. Just I enjoyed our preliminary. Yeah, I did. I went straight out of high school to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, and my goal was to fly. I admit I was part of the Top Gun class entering the academy after the first movie. Wanted to fly and found out on day 1 that I couldn't. But happily, I figured out that going into U.S. Naval Intelligence was an option. And then, again, didn't have an intent to do 30 years, but, the job was challenging and interesting. The people were fantastic. My wife and eventually our children enjoyed taking the journey with me, so it kept being good, and I stayed in. So naval intelligence officers, our career path is still very sea-centric, but that's largely on large deck ships.
Naval intelligence, it's particularly interesting to me because I'm a journalist, and I sort of play in the space between the public and experts, and my job is to kind of try to understand both. And I do know that as someone who interfaces with a really broad variety of the public, a lot of people think that the United States is this kind of shadowy hegemon that, is up to all kinds of skullduggery. And for them, the military, in particular military intelligence, is a very abstract idea. So it's really cool to have you on. You are the real thing. You are a living, breathing, retired U.S. naval officer involved in naval intelligence. And so I'm really keen to get your perspective. You served aboard an aircraft carrier, more than one aircraft carrier, I guess, Tomcats. And you have that kind of operational perspective. And then you ultimately, not ultimately, but you spent some time as a director of intelligence at the U.S. European Command at RAF Molesworth. Is that right?
It is. So, and, again, the U.S. naval, military intelligence in general, the job is to watch the adversary, but also the whole operational environment. And to then distill all that into an assessment to be predictive and to advise the commander or the decision makers. And that can range from, a young Army MI officer is going to be advising, maybe at the company level, small unit tactics, all the way up to, you're briefing the 4-star, who is the commander of U.S. European Command, up to that level. But the bottom line in the old saw in naval intelligence is, the two things you have to do are to get a deep penetrating understanding of the enemy, and you have to have a deep penetrating understanding of your boss, your customer. So the career path that I followed, again, sea duty, but not as much as a surface warfare officer or a submariner or an aviator. But I did, like I said, my first tour with the Tomcat Squadron, deploying on a carrier. I did a tour with an amphibious staff. So getting out and seeing the Navy Marine Corps team at work. My other operational tour was a year-long deployment to Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa in East Africa. But then we also have a lot of joint time. And that's not just exposure to the folks in the other uniforms. It's kind of operating at that joint combatant commander level. So, as in
when you say joint, you're talking about like UK, other European militaries primarily?
That we would say combined or allied. So when I say joint, it's about the 4 U.S. services operating together.
Oh, I see.
So that's
so you went to the U.S. Army War College for a master's degree.
Yeah, so that's an example. I did the U.S. Army War College was my senior service school, so I can speak their language. So go back to 1986, and the Goldwater-Nichols Act made us operate jointly. Instead of separate stovepipes doing our own thing, we had to work together. And that was first shown in Desert Shield, Desert Storm. But when you talk about how the U.S. fight wars, it's at the Joint Combatant Commands, U.S. European Command.
Got it.
U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. And so that's that's where you're operating as a military intelligence officer for the most part too, not just at the unit level, not just at the operational level, but at that joint combatant command level.
It's interesting to get your perspective on this because as I said, a lot of people see the U.S. military as this kind of shadowy octopus that like it can do anything anywhere. But from your perspective, you've got to worry about the different branches, your different allies. You've got to worry about your adversary, but also your adversary's geopolitical context and their adversaries, which might be your allies or maybe your adversaries too. So you live in a very complicated world, and like you can't just necessarily get something done. You have to work with in this sort of complicated environment.
Yeah, it's definitely a complicated environment. You have to think about the levels that you're working at. So there's a national and strategic level, where the president, the National Security Council are making those decisions. They've got intelligence advice at that level. That 4-star combatant commander has a J2 running his joint intelligence, and then it's all the way down to the unit levels. And whether intelligence.
What is a J2?
J2. So
I'm sorry. What is a J2?
The J2 is the any command's intelligence officer on the staff. So staff's divided up into, and J being joint, but an Army or Marine unit will have an S if they're below general officer. But you get a 1 is personnel, 2 is intelligence, 3 is operations, 4 is supply or logistics, 5 is plans, and 6 is communications. And so we call that the Napoleonic code structure. It goes all the way back to Napoleon. That's how staffs are organized. So you each got your area of responsibility. Come together at the staff level to advise whether it's Napoleon or whether it's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So the Joint Staff in the Pentagon has a J2 that does intelligence.
This is really interesting to me because although it might sound like nitty-gritty, it really shines a light on the fact that we, the consumer of the news, we the citizens of a country on whose behalf decisions are being made and carried out, within these organizations, there are people who are using their human brains to make human decisions, and a lot of what comes out, we might say, oh, well, there was a geopolitical reason why such and such a thing happened, a country was invaded or so forth. But really, it came down to people making decisions, in their brains, and it might have to do with, I really hate my boss or something.
So it always is. It's always about people, but it's working with people. So again, understanding the best intelligence officer knows the questions his boss is going to ask before she asks them. Right, and by anticipating the questions, you've got the answers more ready. But yeah, any decision is a decision by a human being, and you can try to put as much math and science into it as possible. But
so one of the things that is of interest to me, and I will have talked about in a earlier episode, is this idea of the decision cycle, also called the OODA loop. But it's the kind of the perspective of how you make decisions, how your enemy makes decisions, how you can think and act faster than your enemy. And so I wanted to really focus on one part of your career, which was when from 2012 to 2015 you were at RAF Molesworth, and you were looking primarily at the European theater, although I understand you were taking it you were understanding it in the global context. But you were looking primarily at what Russia was doing, what Russia's objectives were. And I was hoping you could kind of bring me up to speed on, from the perspective of U.S. military intelligence, what was Russia's outlook? What did their OODA loop look like?
Yeah, so I think if you look at that, and 2012 was a very interesting time. That period, 2012, 2015, really interesting time to be supporting, U.S. European Command, working in Europe for U.S. And U.S. Department of Defense interests. It was an interesting time. We were focused on the pivot to the Indo-Pacific. We were still trying to get out of Central Command wars, but they were still very much happening. Right? Think about that. That was when ISIS came to the fore, and so we were against ISIS. So, getting to Europe and European Command, part of that was, with all those things going on, we still had an overall sort of national thinking of reset with Russia. So going back to post-Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Union, the West, really tried to embrace Russia, to bring them along, to not have them, spin out of control. And nobody wanted to go back to the Cold War. Nobody wanted that mutually assured destruction. But there were concerns about loose nukes, right? You didn't want the Soviet Union falling apart and bad actors getting their hands on their capabilities. And so there was a lot, the West was really leaning into Russia. The Russia-NATO Council started at that time. But what really, initially it got kind of chaotic. And so you had it turned into the organized criminals, the oligarchs and everything running until, Putin, kind of pulled things back together. And even then, early on, you can go back to 2005 and Vladimir Putin, just sort of solidifying his control. And he said in his annual address to the nation that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. So you already had this mindset, this idea that they needed to rebuild that sort of power, and not Soviet communism, but Russian sort of imperialism. Put Russia back into what they perceived as their right. They didn't think they lost the Cold War. They felt like they were betrayed by the West when they tried to move on to a new phase of things. So you've got this,
and this was pretty disappointing for people who are paying attention, because there had been this kind of post-Cold War optimism that Russia will follow the same path that Germany and Japan did after World War II, in that having cast aside this authoritarian regime, they will now embrace with open arms the prospect of liberal democracy and capitalism, and they will become one of us. They will become an ally, and we will all sing Kumbaya together. And I think there was really this idea that if we just force them to embrace free market principles, everything else will fall in place. And then by 2005, as you were saying, this idea of Putin saying, no, we need to, if not revive the Soviet Union, then at least revive Russia as a major power.
Absolutely.
Following not necessarily liberal democracy, capitalism.
And everything we've got, and the same thing when we first did that pivot to Asia, and it's going to be the Pacific century, and China's going to rise. How do we embrace them at the same time? There's always,
right.
It's one of the, I think, aspects of Western liberal democracy is this optimism, right? That we're doing this right. We're free markets and free peoples and self-determination, and everyone's got to vote. How could anyone not want that? And certainly at the leadership level.
It was kind of the end of history. This idea that history has ended, we've all figured out what the best system of governance is, and we're just going to kind of slowly ease into that. Or not even slowly.
No, and we on our side, the peace dividend that we got, it took us a little bit of time to rebound from the optimistic disinvestment in defense capabilities that happened in those mid-90s timeframes. One of the key points, though, two things that happened with Germany and with Japan post World War II. One is that they were absolutely and utterly defeated. There was no question. There was no chance to waffle, to convince yourself that you were really still good. But the second thing we did was, the Marshall Plan in Europe and the similar efforts, right? We fully invested in rebuilding them. NATO itself, right? The old joke about NATO is to keep the Russians out and the U.S. in and Germany down. It was all fully invested. And we kind of, with Russia post-Cold War, we made those gestures, but it was never as fully developed as the Marshall Plan. And in part, they weren't really interested. They didn't want to be a supplicant. There was still that, no, we got this. Look at us. We're still the world's number 2 nuclear power. Which they still had, and not immediately in the 90s, shortly thereafter. The other big thing that happened was the petro rubles. Right, their wealth of resources came into play, and so again, that's it was still the 90s. You had people were making remarks that it's not a country, it's a gas station with nuclear weapons. But you had all the dollars from that gas station aspect, and again, a lot of it turned into the organized crime, the oligarchs. That's the biggest thing. As Putin came up, he kind of harnessed the oligarchs. I think initially they thought they were controlling him but he turned that around over a period of time. But you still had it was still a feeling that, see, we didn't really, we got betrayed by the West. They didn't welcome us in like they should have. We need to retake our rightful place. And, again, that was 2005, that initial quote from Putin, but you saw, his interviews after this most recent invasion of Ukraine. He's pulling out these maps from the 16th century. So he's got this historically inaccurate, but this view of Russia's rightful place. And he talks about Russian lands and Russian peoples. No, that's Ukraine. It's Ukrainian lands, Ukrainian peoples is a separate language. That's Georgia. That's not Russian lands or Russian peoples. But they took this view initially, go back to 1994 and the NATO enlargement that took place soonest after the end of the Cold War. Former Warsaw Pact nations, more importantly the Baltic states, former Soviet socialist republics. They wanted the collective defense that NATO offered, right? So NATO enlarged then, but Moscow didn't react. Moscow said that's the right, sure, they can go ahead. In 2004, Putin even said, we have this NATO-Russia Council. Why don't you just invite us in? Just don't make us do all the details and the administrative work, right? So, they were, again, it's this idea of taking what they saw as their rightful place. And then
you're saying that in 2004, Russia was willing to take a kind of allied role with NATO? Not part of NATO, but kind of working cooperatively with it?
Well, we started, I'd have to check, exactly. Yeah, the NATO-Russia Council came about after, very soon after the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it's about coordination and cooperation. But Putin floated the idea of NATO membership. I think it was probably a little ploy or grandstanding, but that was out there. So their perspective on it was just they want. So even today, you hear the words you'll hear coming out of Putin, Lavrov, foreign minister statements are a multipolar world. Right? The Cold War was this bipolar arrangement. It was the U.S., it was USSR, and satellites or proxies around each of them. And the Fukuyama end of history that you alluded to earlier, that was, there's one ascendance, and that's it. It's a unipolar system. And the U.S. was a sole superpower. And what you'll hear Russia say, let's make it a multipolar world. Which, again, not even return to bipolar, because that's them acknowledging China and
right.
Is rising as well, but they need to be one of those poles. That's why, they look at the European Union and they set up the Eurasian Economic Union, to try and not mirror it, but pull those nations of the Caucasus and the Black Sea region around them, because they view that as we need to be one of those remaining power poles.
I see. But by the time we get to this 2012-2015 period where you're at RAF Molesworth and you're looking at a world which looks, I think, quite differently from that, because the situation has evolved to the point where, again, you and I had spoken previously, Russia is not so much interested in becoming a node in a multipolar rule-based order, but it is taken on what you called the burn it down philosophy. Could you explain that, how they got there?
So a little different, but I'll also, just add one more kind of note in there that appeared from 2005, and that sort of shift to the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, and then shortly thereafter, the NATO summit of 2008, we were talking about Ukraine and Georgia gaining membership, right? And a couple of people put the brakes on it, and in 2008, Putin invaded Georgia. Right, and occupied South Ossetia and Skinvali or Abkhazia, and we did nothing. Right, maybe some sanctions that were far less effective than what we did in 2014. So, you had this mindset was now they saw that they could act on these views, and that they were willing to do it. But then, if you look at that sort of the conception of the international rules-based order. Post-World War II, we set it up. It's not just about NATO, it's the World Bank and the World Trade Organization and all of these things that everyone can join. Everyone can join in. And I know what we were talking about in our earlier conversation. We talk about those who challenge it, right? We love it. We, U.S., the EU, the European nations, Japan, Australia, because we've succeeded under it. Right? We played by the rules, and now we're all doing well. Some voices in the U.S. That are more isolationist, what I would say to them is, maybe we invested a little more in this international rules-based order. We benefited, more than anyone else. This international rules-based order set up the rising tide to lift all boats. So then you have those who want to challenge it. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Maybe they're just a pariah like North Korea. Iran wants to challenge it because of their worldview, of the Islamic Republic being so vastly different that they feel that international rules-based order is keeping them from getting that. So similar Russia and China. Russia sees that this international rules-based order, so for so many reasons, if we shift to clean energy, their petro rubles disappear. If demographics are destiny for a nation, they don't look good for Russia. So they want to challenge that international rules-based order, but it's very disruptive. Attack it, disrupt it at all costs. They would much rather have international lack of rules where they can do what they want, where might makes right, and that strong man can move across a border into Georgia, can move across a border into Ukraine, can exert their will on other states along their border, and can use economic levers like their energy, hydrocarbon resources, to basically blackmail other countries. And I differentiate that from China. China would love an international rules-based order, but their idea of that is the Middle Kingdom of a millennium ago. An international rules-based order that puts China at the top and everyone else coming to them because they are, they're the Middle Kingdom and they have been forever, but two, their economic power. And so they're more, looking at, they're not going to heed those international rules when they don't want to. But you look at everything that happened from their Belt and Road initiative around the world to, I was just trying to track things down in the South China Sea, just today. They view that, they look at the entire South China Sea as theirs, where the rest of the world says, here's the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and this is what's international waters. And I know you just built an airstrip on that little reef, but because it actually doesn't exist at high tide, that does not give you territorial water rights, et cetera, et cetera. They want a rules set that puts them on top and everyone else supplicant to them.
So I think it's important to understand all of these different agents and actors in play on the global stage, because only by understanding that context does it really make sense what Russia was doing. So from the American perspective, we have this complicated relationship with China, which is on the one hand a powerful engine of the economy, is really propelling worldwide growth, but is also non-democratic, has its own agenda, which might be different from ours. We have to kind of encourage them to play by the rules, but also we're worried about constraining some of their potentially disruptive characteristics, like in the South China Sea and so forth. On the other, at the same time, we were kind of coming out from this period of intense obsession with Islamic radicalism, which didn't really have I think, it was complicated. Let's just leave it at that. But it was a different kind of axis of worry. But then we also had Russia, which is a nation which has shifted its priorities since the fall of the Cold War, had seen the rise of Putin circa 2000. Putin is a former KGB officer who is really obsessed with the kind of almost spiritual aspects of Russian greatness, which we've talked about in earlier episodes. But he has been building up Russian strategic capabilities. He's been rebuilding the armed forces. He's been investing in electronic warfare, espionage, all of the different levers of power that he sees Russia potentially using. And an aspect that we had talked about in our earlier conversation was this idea that he was rebuilding these capabilities and then almost immediately using them as soon as he had them, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, so everything you just said is very insightful in how we look at this. But as you said, Russia, there was that realization. Not that they were betrayed, but that hey, they had a lot of catch up to do. So you can watch Russia and China and watch how they watch us. So going back to 1990, 1991, and Desert Shield and Desert Storm. It was impressive and at the same time, sort of sobering to those two countries who wanted to rise up to this level. So they started acting. So China's shipbuilding far outstripping ours at the moment. But the same thing with Russia. They knew they needed, and first of all, just reform, right? They were practically, their conscript, their Cold War forces are just numbers, right? And conscripts and bodies. So they knew they needed to reform, they needed to modernize, and that started when they had all those petro rubles. But to me, a key thing is the state armament plan of 2011 to 2020. A lot of modernization, a lot of capabilities, they always tried to keep some capabilities. So in the mid '90s, and I was in Hawaii and watching the Russian Pacific Fleet. A lot of the fleet's tied up to the piers, but they get that one Akula class nuclear submarine out that we had to think about. They get that one Oscar II guided missile submarine out there, the classic carrier killer, and get it out into the middle of the Pacific, so that carrier coming across just for regular old peacetime deployment had to think about them. Right, so they always had that niche that they kept, that not just the strategic nukes and the ICBMs, but just enough to make us think. But they realized, the West and their modernization was going so fast, they needed to do something. So for 2011 to 2020, that state armament plan with all those petro rubles was very aggressive, and not just buying new things, but also refurbishing things. But again, they didn't take that 2011 and 2020 plan and say, okay, we'll wait until 2020. Stuff rolled out of the factories or from their refurbishment, they started using it. So long-range aviation would be the example of that. Upgraded their long-range aviation, not even new, just upgraded those old airframes, and then they started moving from the Kola Peninsula all the way down through the North Sea, play around the UK, get all the way down to the Strait of Gibraltar, right? And which are also, oh, by the way, these are sort of profiles that mock up how you would strike A or B or C. Out in the Pacific, their long-range aviation would go and circumnavigate Japan. So as soon as they had their stuff, they wanted to use it. They kept flexing their muscles. And they already, don't forget, they already had invaded Georgia with little to no reaction from the West. So, circling back, 2012, I'm arriving, at U.S. European Command. Overall, we're shifting to the Indo-Pacific, but we're still more committed than we want to be in the Middle East and Central Command. And our official policy was reset with Russia. This is going to be, we can manage this rather than fight this. And that wasn't in Russia's plans at that time as they upgraded all this.
Now, one of the things also that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting was this idea, and I might have misheard you, but the primacy of the objective. Could you explain that idea?
I think I mentioned that in the sense of when we do joint planning or strategy development, in the West. Again, I went to the U.S. Army War College, and we look at Clausewitz, and it's about the objective, and whether at the strategic level, war is politics by other means, because it's about the strategic and political end state that we're trying to get to. Just think of that end state, and it translates into other areas. Stephen Covey's 7 Habits begin with the end in mind, right? So if you get to, and I actually do teaching in that joint professional military education, you're teaching joint planning, you start with the objective. And you start at the strategic level. And if you're talking about the operational level of war, so that 4-star joint combatant commander in Europe or in Indo-Pacific Command, right? You start at the strategic level, and what the strategic objective is defines what you want to do at that operational level of war. And you identify the objective, and you have to look at the objective before you start figuring out, I need that piece of equipment, I need that unit, we're going to do A and B and C in our plan, you got to figure out what you're trying to do at the end. Russia's strategy really isn't. They have a picture of what they want, but they don't have this desired end state, and then we balance the ends and ways and means is how you develop a strategy. They know what they want things to look like, but they're very much opportunistic or reactive. And when a situation presents itself, this ending is good, this ending is bad for what we want, and they'll act. So that plus autocracy gives you a certain ability to move quickly and with initiative, but because you don't have that underpinning, of solid strategic thinking, you might have agility, but agility can sometimes lead to tumbles.
I think this is really important and worth underlining, because as we look at Russia and try to understand what it is going to do, we tend to put ourselves in their shoes and we imagine, well, what would I do if I was in their situation? And I think that can be a dangerous instinct, because you are part of an establishment that is highly professionalized. You got your master's degree in strategic studies. You've spent a lot of time thinking about this in a professional way. And when you go into a meeting and you offer your analysis and offer your suggestions, you are getting pushback from other people in other branches, your superiors, your underlings, and you're doing this everyone is as a professional, and you've all been trained that the objective has to guide everything that you do. Again, and you're deploying these gifts and talents in the context of an adversary who does not have that kind of decision structure. I would imagine that it's much more unitary. You've got this guy, this former KGB officer who came up in the Cold War, and he has essentially unilateral total command power, with complications, of course, and he, as I think you were getting at, does not have this sort of primacy of the objective really baked into his soul. And so you can get these really idiosyncratic and somewhat hard to understand decisions, which may be not strictly rational from this decision-making perspective, and so therefore can be hard to game out.
So, and right, there's, as you do these things, and the rational man theory, right? Well, everyone's going to behave rational. Yes, it's rational, but it's with a different sort of set of assumptions and left and right boundaries that someone's operating under. And as you say, that's important to understand Putin. He's a KGB officer, right? When the Cold War ended and the Berlin Wall fell down, he was in Dresden. I think right at that time he went back to St. Petersburg and just started this sort of political ascent in the new chaotic Russia, but acting like a KGB officer the whole way through. So again, you have to think about what were the assumptions that went into that decision, and so we always go, hey, well, we think that it would be in Russia's best interest to happily join in the international community of nations. But that's not, why would Russia invade their neighbor? Well, because they view it as a buffer state, not as right? Every bit of Russian rhetoric is about the denial of the identification of Ukraine as a nation, as a people, as a separate language. So again, they say Russian lands and Russian peoples. They say they're just little Russians. They say Ukrainian's not even a real language. It's just, although, as the Ukrainian armed forces moved into Kursk, essentially a lot of those people in that border region were speaking Ukrainian as the Ukrainian forces moved in. But, right, so you have to look at, the framing of it. And, you can find the rationality for the decision. And, I think the bottom line is Putin's, core belief is that might makes right. And some of that being founded by everything that happened in the 80s and in the 90s, that if Russia's fall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was because they weren't strong enough. So if might makes right,
it seems like
we
there's
need might.
It seems, as kind of a consequence of that, it seems that there is a bias towards action. You had mentioned before that as he was getting these capabilities, he was deploying them or using them very quickly and almost not in the optimal way, just because he had them. And so it can be, I think part of the difficulty of grappling with a guy like Putin, who's in charge of a country with the economy the size of from Italy, I think. It's actually quite interesting. I've been comparing Russia to Mexico. Mexico is about to surpass it in terms of both GDP, population, and GDP per capita. And so basically you imagine Mexico, but then like spread it out across Canada and then have it be super, super aggressive with the means at its disposal. I think really he doesn't have a lot of cards up his sleeve, except for the fact that he's highly unpredictable from our perspective.
Yeah, multiple things to kind of unpack there. It goes back, yes, I think there is a realization that, again, demographics are destiny. Even within the Russian Federation, the population growth is in those outlying regions and not ethnic Russians. And even your Kadarovites coming out of Chechnya. So there's some realization of that, and it's as much trying to rage against that leads to some of the decisions. But you said the bias to action. Again, it's not this long-term, well-thought-out strategy. Yeah, they know what they want to look like, but when crisis pops up somewhere, like the Maidan protests in Kyiv, it's this would be good and this would be bad, and they dive at the good without taking all that else in. And again, another difference I'd highlight, President Xi Jinping told his military a couple of years ago to develop the capabilities to be prepared, if required, to return Taiwan to ourselves, forcefully if need be. That's a big sort of strategic kind of hook to think about, and certainly in the U.S. and I hope other Western countries were thinking of that. But right, it was, I think at the time 9 years. I think it was, a couple of years ago. So it was years in the future. It was be ready at that time. Be ready to do it, and they're not. They're more than willing to act forcefully in areas where they feel that South China Sea, absolutely willing. That one they understand. Well, no, we do need the conditions to be ripe for 2027 to look at that. But right, it's a longer term mindset. Again, there's a lot of old saws about China thinks in millennia, and we're thinking we have trouble thinking in a year or a 5-year fiscal cycle. And
they do seem much more calibrated. You and I are talking of just a few days after there was a collision between a Chinese and a Philippine Coast Guard vessel. Yep. And when you compare it to just like rolling over your neighbor with tanks and helicopters, it seems like a slightly micro level, way of engaging in conflict.
And I think both of them, though, are they're going to do what they can get away with. And either they know they can get away with it, or they strongly suspect they can get away with it. So the Philippines stands up to them. We voice support for the Philippines, but they still are getting away with these physical steel-on-steel actions in the South China Sea. And then to circle back around this, the key thing to look at is, well, why would you invade Ukraine? Why would you do this? Again, I always try to refer to it as Putin's third invasion of Ukraine, following Crimea in 2014 and the Donbass in 2014. But why would you do this full-scale invasion? And I think you have to look at what were those strategic bad assumptions or bad strategic assumptions that Putin made at that time. And I think, one, he overestimated what their capabilities really were. Right? So we saw that initial run, and they ran out of fuel. Well, because they were selling the fuel for vodka while they were manning up on the border. But they overestimated their own capabilities, underestimated Ukraine, both their military capabilities, which we had just spent 7.5 years training them. So even when we were dithering about providing we can't give them something that's lethal assistance. We had training teams in country, the U.S. and the U.K. and Canada and other NATO nations. So underestimated the Ukrainian armed forces capability, underestimated the Ukrainian national will, right? And so some of that is truly believing that they're just little Russians, we just need to bring them back in, but totally misunderstanding that Zelensky was going to say, I don't need a ride, I need ammo. And that the Ukrainian people would have the resilience that they still do today. I think, their continued strikes on civilian population centers and civilian infrastructure, that's just a continuation of that misassumption. They think that's going to make the Ukrainian people give up, and I think it just makes it stronger. But the third big strategic misassumption was that the West would roll over. So sporting that, hey, look at how much of Europe is dependent on our natural gas. Look at how much they're dependent on trade with us. So not just Germany and the natural gas, but Italy. There's an expectation because the amount of trade, you compared them as economic size, but the amount of trade between them was significant beforehand. So they underestimated the collective resolve of the West. And that's, their disinformation campaigns are about divisions, not just in every country where they're putting out misinformation and disinformation and backing up ultranationalist groups, but they were everything that's information to get division amongst NATO, right? This alliance that's been so successful has to do it at consensus. So you get a couple of Germany or a couple other countries that are energy dependent. You get a couple of Baltic nations that might be cowed, and they thought that the West would roll over. So I think the unity, but also the strength. The sanctions were stronger than they expected. Still not strong enough. They still have loopholes. They're still getting by, but the Western reaction was also not what Putin expected 2.5 years ago.
But that was informed by their experience post-Maidan, where, and I want to ask you about the shift, what I perceive as a shift in Russian aggressiveness and their strategic posture, where post-2014 you see a wave of hacking, misinformation, assassination, various kinds of gray zone activities. And do you think that there was an uptick, and do you think that the response to that wave of aggression was partly to blame for Putin's thinking that there wouldn't be much of a response in 2022?
So I think somewhat, and yes, I mean, it's really, again, a lot to unravel in all of that. But yeah, the hybrid or gray zone, all of those things that are not a full-scale invasion rolling across the border, but are easier to deny. They're deniable. They're not attributable. They're going to sow confusion. And they're not, keep it below the threshold where your adversary reacts forcefully and can beat you force on force. Keep it down here where they don't. Yeah, all that certainly was, I would say, was happening before Maidan. I would say 2013-14 was a continuation of that, not a start of that, certainly. Georgia and the 2008 invasion started with a big cyber takedown. Numerous cyber attacks, specifically in the Baltic states. There's a reason Estonia hosts the NATO Center of Excellence for cyber defense. Right, so they've been doing it, and they've been taking these actions. I think the events of 2013, 2014, again, complex, and yep, you've got that. We've been getting away with this, and we've been getting away with this, and we've been getting away with this. There is also an overreaction out of being scared. So if you look at what happened in 2013, Yanukovych, Putin puppet, in power in Kyiv, and the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, passed a measure aligning with the European Union, and not, but just sort of it's an eventual, it's a future thing. It was not even, we need to apply from every. It was shifting back to the Euro-Atlantic community and aligning with the European Union. And Yanukovych vetoed that because, right, Russia had set up this parallel Eurasian economic union, and the Caucasus nations and the other nations of the Black Sea region were supposed to come on board, and again, that multipolar piece, and Ukraine rejected that Russian Eurasian solution, turning to the Euro-Atlantic community, and again, not NATO at Russia's borders, the possibility of Ukraine aligning with the Euro-Atlantic community in the EU. Yanukovych vetoed it. People turned out in masses. That was the Maidan movements in Kyiv. That was late 2013, and that we were watching this, and his reaction immediately to Maidan was more of that sort of hybrid and gray zone. Who was that up on the roofs that took the shots that killed, I think, 100 people in one night? I think a lot of people say those were Russians, whether Spetsnaz or FSB or GRU. Those were Russians, not Yanukovych's people in there. So, but again, that Ukrainian identity, nationality, pride, that was the first time that it came to the fore. And then eventually, and again, after that gray zone response backfired, and the Ukrainian popular response was even stronger, that Yanukovych fled. And then Putin reacted with, again, a hybrid, non-attributable, deniable, the little green men going into Crimea, and seizing Crimea. That, okay, in 1991, when Ukraine voted for independence, then it had certain autonomies already. Crimea voted at something like 91% in favor of Ukrainian independence. Right? This was not same thing in Donetsk and in Lugansk. This was astroturf, not grassroots. But again, it was that hybrid piece. It was really just more of the same. It was a watershed event because
it's really interesting to see the degree. I had an earlier guest who was talking about the various degrees of deniability that get applied, where sometimes things are pretty obvious and sometimes they're more subtle, or sometimes it's extremely subtle. But the little green men, we're just locals uprising, and a lot. I have to say, from my perspective as a Western journalist, I feel like the Western press, who wasn't up to speed at all on any of what we've just been talking about, they took these claims at face value and thought, and for many years, like the war in the Donbass was referred to as like an insurrection or something. And I wanted to ask you about your perspective from naval intelligence. 2 years after you arrived in Molesworth, the Russians, the war was not going well in the Donbass. The GRU brought a surface-to-air missile launcher into the Donbass. This was a GRU operation. They parked it under a major airway. They waited several hours. Many airliners flew overhead. And then after several hours, this regular Army unit pulled the trigger and shot down a Malaysian airliner. Immediately, there's several things that are interesting about this to me. One is that the way that the West found out was that Putin was on a call, a prearranged call that had been arranged the day before with Obama. He told Obama. That's how they found out. Because as the air traffic control was figuring out that something had happened to this plane and slowly figuring out what had happened, somehow Putin already knew and was telling Obama about it. And a bunch of stories came out. Like immediately, the GRU and Russian bloggers started putting out a whole spew of stories. One of which was that this was we don't know, some militiamen got their hands on this launcher. They didn't know how to use it. They didn't know what they were shooting at. And at the time, that was universally accepted. And I think a lot of people to this day still think that it was some kind of accident. My perspective is that a regular Russian army unit that has a strategic level anti-aircraft missile is very highly trained on how to use it. There's a very specific command structure. And these things never operate independently. They operate within a integrated air defense network. They are connected to sensors and command structures that give an order that comes down a command line. It wasn't militia just pushing a button at random. You have to have an order from several ranks of a hierarchy above you. And I was just wondering how, what your perspective on this incident was, sitting in naval and military intelligence.
Yeah. So the whole that false narrative of an insurrection, and first starting with the idea that was put out there and I just saw it on Twitter very recently that Kyiv was outlawing the Russian language, and you've got Russian speakers in this area, and also in Odessa, and absolutely false. Right, there was no oppression of ethnic Russians or of Russian speakers, but you had from day one, you had Russian GRU agents leading these supposed grassroots, insurrection or uprisings or movements. So it was false from the outset. But as you said, a lot of people, whether it's the flaw of journalism is it rather than identify truth, it's we got to do both sides. Well, one side is lying.
Yeah.
But, right. So there's this sort of they're stopping. All of these again. Successful disinformation or misinformation. You don't need your lie to be accepted by 51% as truth. You just need enough lies out there for everyone to doubt the truth. Or say, well, I couldn't tell you that that's actually Russia. I couldn't tell you that Strelkov is actually Russian GRU. Maybe he's a local boy. I don't know. You just need to create that doubt. And so the same thing, the division, the doubts, that's the outcome when you get into operating in that sort of information arena. Very happy to see after I left Molesworth, I actually did a fellowship with the Atlantic Council in DC for a year. I'm still active duty. Very happy to see the Bellingcat report on all of that with open source indications of exactly what there is, because it was I carried it around for a while so I could make sure I was speaking at the open source level. But yeah, that was always Russian led, and actually that was a debate that we had. I'll say this much, at Jack Molesworth and European Command, and you're coordinating with Defense Intelligence Agency in DC and you're getting these video conferences, and we really pushed to make sure we were phrasing it as Russian-led separatists. Right, that this was Russian-led separatists, and just keep that drumbeat going in that regard from before MH17, but definitely afterwards, because it was obvious to, again, the Bellingcat study does a very good job saying it open source. It was obvious to everyone in the intelligence community that was Russians, and the question was the level of intentionality of it.
This question of the level of intentionality is, I guess, the core of what I wanted to ask you about. I feel that even Bellingcat, actually, I've talked to Eric Toller about this, they think it was accidental. I find that hard to believe for other reasons. What is your? Is there at least some doubt about this question within the intelligence community?
So, acknowledging on the one side what you say, it's a very structured and hierarchical command. Well, but this wasn't a regular force. They were already doing things irregularly, right? They were working with their supposed Donetsk or Lugansk People's Republic forces. She already had that level of irregularity. So I think you have to give some credence to the lower level commander exceeding their authority. Again, because you don't have that same strategic rolling down to operational, rolling down to tactical. You don't understand task and purpose and method, right? When you don't that joint coordination and joint command and control and joint planning that we talk about is the key things that are lacking and that keep them, despite improving their technical capabilities of their equipment, but they still lack the underlying operations and command and control expertise.
I guess I wonder if there's a reason to think that the order did not come from the top, other than it's hard to imagine why they would do it.
So
I mean, is there a
that's
reason
certainly
why
part of
you
it.
would think this could not have been ordered from the top?
So there is, and what we see today is that we deter ourselves. And worrying too much about Russian escalation. Every piece of gear from Javelin anti-tank weapons to F-16s, everything that's gone in there, whether the capability being an upgrade or the numbers, we've sat and we've taken far too much counsel of our fears of Russian escalation. We've deterred ourselves every step of the way. From even during the force buildup, when we did very good things with the pre-bunking by declassifying the intelligence information, it didn't end up deterring Putin, but I think it did, change some things in that regard. And some of the things, we talked about, watch for this false flag operation. Crap, we can't do that. It didn't deter. Right, the decision to invade was taken. You weren't going to deter the decision to roll the divisions across the border. But we've deterred ourselves, and we've taken so much fear of escalation, and none of those things has led to, what would truly be escalation. Because you've got missile and glide bomb and one-way drone strikes on apartment buildings and schools and hospitals. You're striking at civilian energy and electricity infrastructure in the hopes that people will freeze in the winter. Right? You're way beyond the pale, were 10 years ago, in the sense of the UN Charter and hey, we shouldn't invade across international borders. What's left to escalate? Right? So really the only things left to escalate are fight with NATO, which I view it, he's not going to do it. You're going to continue to see gray zone stuff. You're going to continue to see Belarus push migrants across the borders in Poland and Lithuania. You're going to see, various and assorted misinformation, disinformation. But he does fear Article 5. And the idea that he's not going to attack it. So take that off the table. The other true escalation possible would be the use of tactical nukes in Ukraine, or non-strategic nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And I don't think he's going to do that. Because what we have done is very strongly warn him the consequences will be grave. And I think you leave that open-ended enough, right, that you're not doing, right, that's always the challenge, and you say, hey, here's our red line. Okay, a guy like Putin or Xi will go, oh, I can operate all the way up to the red line then. I'm fine up until I hit that red line. The other thing is if you get too specific about what you're going to do back, he's going to go, all right, let me do the math. Let me figure out the math on that. Whether this is worth it.
It doesn't seem like he does do the math on like what are the consequences of my actions. I mean, I think one of the reasons that people really, including the Ukrainians, apparently didn't think he was going to invade in 2022 was that it seemed insane. It seemed unwinnable. I mean, or at least a catastrophic. Strategically, I mean, even if he had defeated Ukraine, it would have been such a terrible. I don't know, and clearly the way it played out was a terrible thing.
I think
but
the math is there, but it's another set of us operating on our own assumptions, where we don't want to needlessly throw away 100,000 or 200,000 lives and another 400,000 injured by pushing wave after wave of meat assaults, and I think that's how the Russians are doing their Telegram channels, right? Our calculus, we value those human lives. We value those lives of our soldiers. His calculus doesn't assign that same value. So this is a risky, the threat from the U.S. was that they would take out our forces in Ukraine. So he's going to do that math.
Right, right.
It's only a few 100,000 lives. Well, this is worth it.
A question I constantly get is, what does U.S. intelligence think happened in situation X? Or do they know what happened in situation X? And two parts to this. First, I do want to just circle once more back to the MH17 issue. It sounds like your perspective, having come through the naval intelligence ranks, is that you also don't really know what exactly happened or why it happened. Already several Russians have been convicted in absentia for shooting down MH17, but they've been convicted more of like creating the conditions under which it happened rather than giving the order for it to happen. And so I think the consensus view is that it was not ordered from above. My particular suspicion is that it was. But am I correct in assuming that like really there isn't a clear understanding of why this trigger was pulled?
So I think I'd highlight, you have convictions. So the level of evidence to gain a conviction is that much higher, and right, you don't go and try someone on a theory. You try them on the evidence that you've got, and you'll freak. Right. So complete. That's a different situation, and you do what you can in that sense with what evidence that you have. And then the other thing that anyone military should talk about is the fog of war and the friction of war. Right? We certainly, see it ourselves for 20 years in the CT fight in hot and dusty places. Whether a team leader, platoon commander, division commander, you've got a certain amount of fog and friction that's going to create doubt, and that two guys in a firefight right next to each other are going to come back and recount that completely different ways. So it was.
Do you think it might just be unknowable at some level?
Yeah, possibly.
I mean, there is a lieutenant who gave the order to pull, right? I mean, there is at least one guy who knows because he did it, right?
So yeah, if we can find that guy, sure.
I mean, one of the interesting things about this case is that you often hear people say, well, this conspiracy couldn't have really existed because surely it would have had to involve a lot of people, and surely somebody would have talked. Nobody has talked. I mean, there has been various intercepts and wiretappings and things and other kinds of evidence. But I don't think anybody came forward and said, as has happened, like, for instance, with the Olympic doping scandal, where a guy who was instrumental in that conspiracy came forward and said, yeah, I organized this conspiracy. But in the case of MH17, nobody has broken ranks.
And so the question is, what are you looking at then? Is it a cover-up afterwards that surely someone would have broken ranks now and said something?
Right.
Or if you had a top down through 13 echelons of command, surely someone would have said something. So the idea that no one has come out, and if you're looking at it from the second of those, that supports the argument that it was a fog of war, frictional war moment, and it wasn't, in fact, top all the way down to the firing unit. Somewhere in that vehicle or in a level or two above, somebody messed something up, right? So the idea that no one's broken ranks could be used to defend the idea that it wasn't a Kremlin down.
That's true. I guess my point was that either way, it was an operation. I mean, we know that the GRU brought this thing across. So nobody, whether it was a big operation or a small operation, I don't know what the relative size of these different operations would have to be. I mean, arguably it could be quite small if it was just, the Kremlin telling the operational commander to do this thing. I do think like a major hang-up is like, why would they do it? But anyway, we're slightly getting into the weeds of a kind of unknowable thing, I think, here. But the big picture is that it's just been incredibly interesting to kind of get inside, the shoes of somebody who was seeing all of this development of this geopolitical thing happening. Really, you had a front row seat, and so it's really so interesting to get your perspective on it.
Well, and it was right. It was interesting at the time. It was a intellectually challenging mission and rewarding to be doing it. Right, you're making a difference, and to be doing it with, as I think I said before, 300 amazingly smart and talented people. Working on the problem sets plural that we had at that time, it was
the fruits of that time are being born now, in a sense that we're seeing. We're now in year two and a bit of this invasion, this full-scale invasion that has drawn down Russian military might to a significant degree. There's all these OSINT Twitterers who are sort of showing how many few AFVs there are and how many tanks there are in their reserve store facilities. I mean, what is just quickly, and maybe we can leave it on this note, but like, how do you see this playing out? What is Russia's position going to be when this war ends?
So I think one important thing to think about is, regardless of the ending outcome, whether it's truly victory for Ukraine on Ukraine's terms, return to the 1991 internationally recognized borders, or somewhere in between somehow, regardless of the outcome, I think Russia's imperialist ambitions will remain. So one, it still is hard to see a path to Putin truly and fully being ousted, right? Neither a palace coup nor a grassroots, the opposition. Finally, a great Vladimir Kara-Murza is out of jail. I'm ecstatic about that. But what's the path for to truly oust Putin? It's very difficult to see that sort of path. But even say there is that, and it's not Putin, the Russian national identity is still going to have these sorts of imperialistic ambitions. Still going to hear those words of Russian lands and Russian peoples. Still going to want a buffer. Still going to desire their quote-unquote rightful place in a multipolar power structure. And what you will see then, even as the military capabilities get downgraded, you'll see more and more of the hybrid, of the gray zone. Cyber and misinformation and disinformation, political warfare, economic warfare. You're absolutely going to see that at the conclusion of this. And that's what Ukraine already is, more so than us, but that's what the Euro-Atlantic community needs to be prepared for.
I think what you're talking about is a very logical and clear-eyed view of the continuation of current trends. Of course, history, and in particular Russian history, has a tendency for major inflection points where all bets are thrown out. And, obviously the fall of the Berlin Wall was pretty surprising, I think, to a lot of people, including the intelligence community. So hopefully maybe we'll get another break like we did then. And I mean, I like Russia. I like Russians. I'm an admirer of the culture and the people. I would like to see a happy, prosperous Russia, but whatever, hoping and a dollar gets you a cup of coffee, right?
Right. And the military axiom is to get peace, you prepare for war. And so some of that is, if you look at it, that cyber and everything, that's not just tanks and ships and aircraft and soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines. If you're talking about the cyber and the misinformation and the economic warfare, these are not just defense, right? It's whole of government and it's whole of society resilience that we need to be considering, not just for Russia, but for China.
And other threats to emerge. I mean, countries can suddenly go rogue, like Venezuela or what have you. Steve, I could talk to you all day. I won't take up all your time, though. I want to, thank you for being so generous with your time and expertise.
You're absolutely welcome, Jeff. This was a pleasure for me, too.
There's one last thing I want to ask you, and this is kind of an addendum to our conversation because it's a little bit out there. I have been looking for a long time at MH370. This is an MH370 podcast. And one of the reasons I'm so interested in Russia is that I have spent a lot of time looking at the cybersecurity aspect. I'm actually working on an article right now for Vanity Fair about cybersecurity vulnerability. It's kind of in the context of, this gets back to gray zone stuff, but the GPS jamming and spoofing, particularly what's called smart spoofing. And it turns out, I mean, this is another point to be debated, but I think that there is a that MH370, the plane that disappeared after taking off from Kuala Lumpur, it had a cybersecurity vulnerability that could have been exploited. That could have, and if it was exploited by Russia because the signals mean that the plane went to Kazakhstan. it's a very complicated case. It's a very technical. The entire podcast like kind of goes back and forth of different aspects of evidence. And I wanted to get your perspective, if you have any opinion on this, if it is possible, or is it something that the intelligence community has considered and rejected, or has considered and doesn't know, or any perspective on that?
So I'll start saying I don't have any particular knowledge or specifics, very little of the MH370 case, in and of itself. But talking in a more general sense about the cyber threats and cybersecurity, and I think the issue is that, we're in this information age, and everything is interconnected. The Internet of Things, and everything from your doorbell to your fridge to your car, all being overly connected. Well, every connection is a vulnerability. Every connection is an opening, potentially. So, something like ADSB, flight tracking, is intentionally open, because that's good for everybody that is open. Well, as soon as it's open, it's a vulnerability. I can have a great piece of intelligence, and I'm very concerned about the source. And I can keep that a secret if I don't tell anybody. But there's a decision maker somewhere that needs that, right? So everything, security, whether information or cyber or whatever, is about risk management. And you're going to have to open it somewhat, but keep it closed otherwise. And think about the vulnerabilities and address them. So it's not just, sorry about that. So flight tracking, but also ships at sea. Use an automated identification system. It's far more optional, but we see it being spoofed in numerous examples. Or GPS, as you said, spoofing. The Baltic Sea, is in moments can become a very dangerous place to operate because of the GPS spoofing and other electronic warfare and AIS spoofing. The HMS Defender and the Dutch ship accompanying her in the Black Sea in 2021. They were doing freedom of navigation, wherein, those, again, the international rules-based order, we say we're allowed to drive through here peacefully because there's an extra legal claim, and the Russian forces truly got unsafe and unprofessionally acted. Well, just before that actual incident at sea, there was AIS spoofing, putting each of those ships in a location that was false. So absolutely, definitely a Russian capability being, not just exercised in that way, but manipulated otherwise. And again, not just something like civil aviation, the sanctions, the evasion of the sanctions currently by Russia. You got to track these ships, whether oil or natural gas cargoes or grain. So grain stolen from the occupied regions of Ukraine being shipped out, and they're shuffling and spoofing AIS and GPS to do this sanctions evasion. So again, it's a broader sort of issue and concern to be addressed again as we as an international community need to look at these hybrid kind of actions and how we can be resilient enough to get by them to, again, continue to ensure that international rules-based order benefits all 6 or 7 billion of us.
Yeah, I think it's possible to make a strong case, and I try to make it in this article, that this is a real concern and needs to be taken seriously. And it's not really in the habit of, say, the FAA to worry about security as much as it worries about safety, which, as you've said, is somewhat diametrically opposed, as with ADSB. But the idea that a cyber hack could have already been carried out in a way that was sort of undetectable is obviously highly controversial. But is it something that it sounds like you haven't heard anything about it, but I wonder if it's something that the intelligence community at some level would have at least taken a look at.
I have no specific information about the incident or about what anyone is looking at regarding it.
Yeah, which makes sense. Steve, I'm so grateful for your time once again. Okay, so I had a couple of take-homes from that fabulous interview with Steve Harrell. First of all, that Russia is essentially opportunistic or reactive in its strategic posture. They don't follow this idea of the primacy of objectives. They don't lead with their strategic objective. They tend to react to the environment in which they find themselves. So you can have agility in that situation, but it can also lead to tumbles, as Steve put it. So they might make decisions that don't necessarily make sense from a strategic perspective, like invading Ukraine, or maybe by taking MH370. Maybe if your espionage chiefs come to you and say, we've got this capability, we just cooked it up, we just invented it, we spent a little bit of money on it, and now we can do it. Maybe if you're thinking about the idea in a reactive way, you've got this notion of, well, if I don't use it, I lose it. So maybe the first time that opportunity arises to pull it out of your back pocket, you use it, whether or not it makes absolute sense to make that decision. So maybe the answer to why would Russia steal MH370 is at least in part because it could. Another take home, Steve talked about gray zone activity, and the characteristics are deniable, not attributable. They're going to sow confusion, but keep it below a level where the adversary reacts forcefully. We're going to see a lot of this kind of thing in the years that followed from 2014 up until the present time: sabotage, misinformation, hacking, and the like. A third point is at the end there, Steve talked about what he called whole of society resilience in the face of misinformation and gray zone warfare. And I think that's what this podcast is about. I am trying to make this conversation, I'm trying to bring to the fore discussion and understanding about the fact that this gray zone activity is taking place, what some of its manifestations might be, with the goal that we can change our thinking and thereby change our actions. We can be more protective of ourselves and in that way more robust and resilient. Finally, a question that I was, of course, dying to ask. I asked Steve whether the intelligence community had assessed the possibility of a cyber hijack of MH370. I've been wondering this for many years. He said he didn't know, but he described the vulnerabilities that are opened by widespread wireless connectivity, and how taking advantage of these vulnerabilities is something he called, quote, definitely a Russian capability. But he doesn't know whether they've thought about this or not. That would be probably pretty secret. But thanks again to Steve Harrell. That was super fascinating and something I've been wanting to do for a really long time. So I'm really grateful to him for his time and expertise. Okay, let's move on to Community Radar. Akash Dubey reached out to me on LinkedIn. Other people reached out to me other ways as well. He was asking about a story that has been getting so much play lately. One of the headlines was Australian scientist claims he's found where missing MH370 plane is. This is about a claim by a retired scientist from the University of Tasmania named Vincent Line. And he's basically making the claim that he has a paper about to be published in the Journal of Navigation, which is a prestigious journal, and that in his words, this paper proves where MH370 went. Basically, he says that Zahari deliberately piloted the plane so that it would gently come to land, come to rest on the water over Broken Ridge, which is a rough area, and that's where it is. And this has gotten a ton of play. It's funny because things like this surface every couple of months. There are so many problems with this. First of all, I have seen no evidence that this has actually been accepted by the Journal of Navigation. I'm skeptical. I've looked at the paper. Its language is frankly pretty unprofessional, and most of the citations are either newspaper stories or his own non-peer-reviewed papers. Okay, this is a quote from one of these stories. Mr. Line claimed that the plane was deliberately plowed deep into the Broken Ridge, a 20,000-foot deep hole in the Indian Ocean. Okay, this is an extremely poetic, shall we say, description of what is essentially an underwater mountain range. It's some rough terrain. It was searched. And yes, there's steep parts and there's like valleys and stuff. It's not a hole. And it's not 20,000 feet deep. It's quite deep. Maybe parts of it are 20,000 feet deep. But the point is that this is not a new idea. People have suggested this for many, many years. The problem is that one of the problems is that when MH370 disappeared, there was no bathymetry for the area. So no one really knew what was down there. Certainly no one's going to base an elaborate murder-suicide plan based on some vague idea that there was rough terrain down there. Secondly, if Zaharie had planned so meticulously to make sure that the plane would land intact and then float to the bottom of a big hole so that it would never be found, so that the world would never understand what he had done, why did he fly right over Malaysian Air Force Base? That's not a very subtle thing to do. Finally, there's nothing really new here. Line rests his claim on two ideas. The first is that an examination of the flaperon, we recently did a show about mechanical damage to debris and what it shows. He claims that he basically recycles this claim of a guy named Larry Vance, who says that, oh, I've looked at pictures of the flaperon and it was deployed when it tore off from the plane. Therefore, that means the plane was deliberately ditched as gently as possible. I have to tell you that is simply wrong. The Australian authorities who actually examined the piece concluded the opposite. By looking at the damage to the flaperon and by the damage to an adjacent piece, it was actually a flap, a traditional flap that deploys on landing, unlike a flaperon, which moves around all the time. Based on their examination of those two pieces, neither was deployed. So Larry Vance's claims really are just his wild claim. Okay. So the second pillar of his claim is that he has invented a new kind of math to analyze the BFO data with. And according to him, the BFO data does not show that it was in a steep dive, as everyone else thinks, but that according to him, it was actually in a glide, which is why it wasn't found in the area that was already searched, which we've talked about before, this idea there was a glide. That's a pretty heavy claim to make in a non-peer-reviewed paper. Let's see if it pans out. I would actually be pretty surprised if this thing does get published in the Journal of Navigation, because it's a little crazy, frankly. So in conclusion on this theory, I have a lot of skepticism and frankly, a fair bit of disappointment for the media for picking it up and giving a lot of attention. I guess on the bright side, that means that they're still interested in MH370. So hopefully they'll be, amenable to hearing some actual new information. So let's leave it at that. Once again, this has been episode 15 of season 2 of Finding MH370. If you like the show, it sure would be great if you could hit the subscribe button. Also, we have a show page over at findingmh370.com where you can sign up for a free newsletter. If you take a paid subscription, we have now a new feature, which is exclusive, fresh content exclusively for paid subscribers every Tuesday. We then repost that the following week for the general public. Once again, this is Jeff Wise. Thank you for watching. As I always say, don't stop looking and don't stop asking hard questions. See you next time.